Hello, everyone. Thank you for all our in-person attendees and for our virtual attendees. My name is Erica Fike. I'm the program manager for the Department of Data Science at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute, and this is the Frontiers in Biostatistics seminar. And this is our first hybrid seminar in 2 years, so we are a little, we have enthusiastic clapping from the audience. So we are going to do our best to address questions from in-person and from the virtual audience as we go through. So again, it's our first time. Please forgive any technical difficulties, but I'm going to hand it over to Hajime Uno, who was one of our conference organizers, and he will introduce our speaker.
Okay, thank you very much for everyone. Thank you very much everyone for coming. Yes, so today's speaker is the Dr. Maya Ramchandran. So Dr. Maya Ramchandran recently completed her PhD at the Harvard Biostatistics department under the supervision of Dr. Giovanni Parmigiani, where she developed machine learning ensembling strategies with application to cancer prediction problems. She holds a BS in Applied Mathematics Biology from Brown University and a Master's of Music in Violin Performance from New England Conservatory. So she currently works as a data scientist at the ZephyrAI biotechnology startup that develops novel drug combination and repurposing treatment for oncology. Thank you very much for coming. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Giovanni, for organizing this and getting me to come out here. It's really fun to have the opportunity to give this talk in person. So today I'm going to be talking about the work I did during my dissertation research developing tree-based ensembling strategies for handling heterogeneous data. I know that for the people in this room, this is very, very basic information. You're all very familiar with it, but just in case anyone needs a refresher as to what ensemble learning really is, or how I'm going to define it, at least in this talk. Basically, the general paradigm is to combine multiple models with the goal of improving upon the prediction performance of any given one of them. And there are three main components that go into building an ensemble learner. The first is the data partitioning strategy for the building of the component models. You can consider building every single model on all of the training data, or you can partition it into distinct subsets and train a model on each, or you can consider training each model on overlapping subsets of the data, such as on bootstrap samples. The second component is the choice of the learning algorithm used to train the models within the ensemble. And the focus of my talk will be on heterogeneous ensembles in which we choose the same learning algorithm to train all of the models. Finally, once we have a collection of models, we need a way of combining the predictions into one ensemble level prediction. And so that choice of combination strategy will also inform our ensemble performance. So my talk will mostly focus on building ensembles of random forest learners. Random forest itself is already an ensemble learner, where decision trees are trained on bootstrap samples of the full training set, and the predictions from each of the trees are combined just by simple averaging, at least in the classic random forest algorithm. So decision trees the advantages are that they're very intuitive and interpretable. And you can see an example on the left of a COVID workflow. And you basically can just follow down the branches down to your decision, which you obtain at the bottom in what's called leaf nodes. The issues with decision trees is that they tend to overfit to the data, to the training data, and so they don't generalize very well on their own to new data sets. And so random forest mitigates this issue by introducing randomness, hence the name, at multiple steps of the training process, with the overall goal of decorrelating the trees and reducing the overall variance of the predictor. So the first way in which randomness is introduced is by the fact that each tree is trained on a random bootstrap sample of the training data. And so each tree is seeing a slightly different distribution of the training data. Secondly, when each tree is trained, at each split, forming branches, only a random subset of the total variables are even available to form a split. And so that is another way for each tree to kind of now see a different distribution of the covariates within the full training set. And there are a number of advantages to this whole procedure. One is that random forest handles high dimensional data very well, especially the case in which the number of samples or the number of covariates is greater than the number of samples, which we often encounter in biology. So it is also robust to outliers and implicitly handles nonlinear relationships between the covariates and the outcome, including any sort of interactions between the covariates, because it doesn't require explicit specification of an outcome model. It can also incorporate heterogeneous data types within the training data and is effective for either regression or classification tasks. So now that brings us to the point of the talk. Random forest is clearly really great on its own. So where does it need improvements? So we often encounter the issue in which we have training data with heterogeneity in either the distribution of the features or the outcome model or both. And this could be in the form of having multiple training studies available or having a single training data set with some sort of cluster structure within it. So if we just merge all the data and basically ignore any potential heterogeneity, we only end up learning the average relationship between the covariates and the outcome across partitions. And in the loss of this information, this can lead to lack of generalizability to test data, especially when that test data has different covariate distributions. And so the goal is to create more generalizable and accurate predictors by building ensembles of random forests, where each is trained on a distinct partition of the total training data. And these partitions are designed in order to reflect underlying heterogeneity in the training data set. So I will be focusing on two different types of heterogeneity within this talk. The first is what we have termed feature distribution heterogeneity. It simply refers to changes in the distribution of the features or covariates between data sets or partitions of the data. The second is feature effect heterogeneity, and this describes changes in the relationship between the covariates and the outcome across partitions or data sets. And in our simulations, if we have, say, a linear model that describes the outcome generating model, feature effect heterogeneity would be reflected by perturbations of the coefficients within that linear model. So now we can think of adapting to possible heterogeneity in our training data by tweaking the steps of building an overall ensemble learner, specifically in tweaking the data partitioning strategy and in that final combination strategy of combining the predictions from each of our individual components of the ensemble. So the first portion of this talk will be to discuss how to develop a tree weighting strategy to more robustly construct ensembles of forests, specifically when we have multiple studies available for training. In the second portion of this talk, we're going to expand the problem a little bit and now just consider any set of training data, even a single data set that has some sort of natural cluster structure, and see whether we can do a similar partitioning and ensembling strategy here. Our second aim in that portion of the talk is also to see whether we can actually more efficiently partition the data using clustering algorithms rather than necessarily needing to recover the true cluster or partition structure of the underlying data. Finally, I'm going to look into developing a theoretical framework for these methods and specifically show that the upper bound of the mean squared error is strictly higher or worse for classic random forest than for this method of building ensembles of forests over clusters. Okay, so the first part is, again, to explore tree weighting strategies when we have multiple studies available for training. So the multi-study context, which has been explored by Giovanni and the whole lab for now a few years, is based on kind of an intuitive paradigm, as if we have multiple studies that measure the same covariates and outcome we can think of building ensemble learners by training a model on each of the studies and combining it using some strategy. And so my talk is looking at using random forest as that individual model. And random forest, as we discussed, is also itself an ensemble learner. And so you can think of this problem as either considering the forests themselves as the individual components within the ensemble, or extracting the trees and basically considering them themselves as the components that we're interested in either upweighting or downweighting based on how good their performance is. So we essentially want to leverage the predictive ability of individual trees that show particular generalizability to new data sets. And the issue if we don't do this is that we might be averaging out the performance of more beneficial trees within an overall forest and basically losing out on predictive power that we might have been able to get. We want our method to have robustness to external data sets with heterogeneity in the distribution of the features or the outcome model or both, and to implicitly be able to incorporate heterogeneity between any of the training studies in our sets without having to model that explicitly. And as a little mention, ours is the first, at least to our knowledge, tree weighting scheme that's specifically designed for the multi-study setting. So a main focus actually throughout this talk is in the combination strategy that we use to combine the predictions of our individual forests or trees. The general idea in the method that we've chosen is to upweight the learners that show better performance on external studies within the training set, basically on studies that they were not themselves trained on, because the idea is that if they show good performance in this context, they're more likely to generalize to external testing sets. And the idea is we obtain the predictions of every single learner on every single training set where each learner is trained on a specific study. And then we can create a kind of design matrix from these predictions where each column represents the predictions from one learner on every single study within the training set, or what we're calling the merged set of data. And we can basically just regress the true outcomes across all of these studies against the predictions and use the resulting coefficients as the weights within our ensemble. And we found throughout looking at variations to this procedure that including a non-negativity constraint and adding a ridge constraint on the coefficients produce the most robust ensemble across various data generating scenarios. So we're including that kind of within this framework. So finally, we're ready to look at the performance of the possible approaches we could use in this setting. The first is kind of our baseline comparison, which we're calling the merged. And that is simply a single random forest trained on the entire merged set of training studies, essentially not considering any potential heterogeneity between studies. The second trains a random forest on each of the component training studies, but just weights the predictions from the forests equally. So it does not really do anything special in that combination strategy. Next, we have the weighting forests approach, where we now train a forest on each study, and then we combine the predictions using stacked regression, which I just discussed in the previous slide. Finally, we look at what happens when we, in fact, just consider the individual trees as our learners of interest. So we train a forest on each study and then extract the trees and weight them directly using stacked regression. And so now we want to evaluate the performance of all of these methods first in simulations. And so for our setup, we used 15 data sets taken from the curated ovarian data repository in Bioconductor. And this provides clinically annotated gene expression data for around 3,000 total patients. And because we wanted to keep this simulation as close to what we might encounter in real data settings, we used the real covariate data and simply generated an outcome depending on the type of heterogeneity we wanted to model. So for each iteration of the simulation, we first split the 15 data sets into 10 training and 5 validation sets. selected 100 common covariates and sampled 10 of these to form the true outcome model from the covariates within a linear model framework, with the possible addition of interaction terms to increase the complexity. We added specified levels of feature effect heterogeneity that varied between studies through perturbing those coefficients in that linear model between the studies. And so these are the results over 3 different kind of data generating scenarios along the lines of what I just discussed. On the left-hand side, we look at having 2 studies within that set of 10 training studies having interaction terms within the outcome generating model, whereas the remaining 8 and the testing studies did not. In the second panel, we upped that number to 6 studies within training. And then finally on the right, we look at increasing the heterogeneity between the studies as measured by the coefficient perturbation to essentially levels that we would never expect models to perform well on. That would be at the right-hand side of that, of the x-axis on that figure. What we see throughout is that the weighting trees method, shown in green, performs better than all of the other approaches, which kind of follows our intuition that rewarding specific trees that are generalizable would create an overall more replicable predictor. And we see again that weighting forests does nearly as well, and it does better than our 2 baseline comparison approaches. And this kind of indicates the importance of using those stacked regression weights in combining the predictions of individual learners. Something interesting here is that we see that actually the unweighted method, in which we're still building an ensemble of forests, but not using those stacked regression weights, doesn't do as well as the merged in a lot of these simulations. And this kind of highlights the importance of basically rewarding predictors that show generalizability, and of course, the opposite of downweighting those that don't. And if we don't do that, it's not necessarily beneficial to even use an ensembling framework. What is
the dependent variable in ovarian studies? So that's the question.
What is the dependent variable? Oh, it's gene expression data. Yeah. And so yeah, here the covariates will be genes, and we will have measures of the expression. And so for our real data example, we use 6 studies from the curated breast data repository, also from Bioconductor, which measures around 500 total patients and over 1,000 common gene features. And as our outcome, we consider the task of predicting the expression level of one gene given the rest of the set for the 500 most variable genes, hence how we were able to calculate these error bars. And what we see, so our metric of performance is the % change in the average root mean squared error from the merged learner, from that baseline random forest learner. And what we see is that actually all 3 ensembling approaches perform better than the merged. And the weighting trees the most so, and improves by about 20% in terms of prediction performance. And overall, we see kind of a similar relationship between the approaches as we saw in simulations, which is further confirmation that using an ensembling framework when dealing with multiple studies is beneficial. So now we can consider if we can use a similar framework when we have a single training study with some sort of cluster structure within it, and whether we can actually estimate the clusters using unsupervised clustering algorithms and more effectively build ensembles of forests on those. So the motivation for this project was that data sets containing natural clusters or batch effects are extremely common across most biological applications, and actually non-biological applications too. And so we need prediction algorithms to be able to handle this possible heterogeneity in the distribution of the features. And kind of as I discussed in the intro, is that standard approaches might display poor generalizability because they're only considering the marginal average distribution of the covariates. And so we can consider a similar strategy as we use in the multi-study setting, where we build ensembles of forests over some partitioning of the data. And our additional goal is to determine whether the true clusters make actually the best partitions for ensembling, or whether estimated clusters would actually improve upon this. So to that end, the method that we explore within this project is the cross-cluster weighted forest. And first, we assume that through one way or another, we've determined the number K of desired partitions of the data. And one data-driven way of choosing K is through using metrics such as the silhouette score. But there are a few different ways that one can think of doing this. You could do in cross-validation, but for the purposes of this, we assume that we've somehow chosen this value K. We can then run a clustering algorithm such as K-means on the entire set of covariates within the training data, and then train a random forest on each of the resulting clusters from the K-means. Finally, as before, we compute stacked regression weights for all of the forests and combine the predictions to form the final ensemble. And so again, as before, we want to compare this method to other possible ensembling techniques that essentially tweak various steps in the process. So as always, our baseline comparison is with the merged learner, which again represents basically the classic random forest algorithm trained on the entire training set. The abbreviation cluster is going to be used to describe the cross-cluster weighted forest approach I just discussed. The next one we've abbreviated as the multi because it's basically similar to multi-study learning in flavor, is that in simulations, we can simulate data sets where we know the true cluster structure, we know the true indices of each sample. And so we can, in fact, divide the training data into the true clusters, train a forest on each, and combine using those stacked regression weights. Finally, we have what I've abbreviated as the random method, which is to, instead of clustering into K distinct partitions, we just randomly subset the data into K equally sized partitions and train a forest and compute stacked regression weights. And this is to see if we can really pinpoint the benefit to clustering over other kind of partitioning methods. So in order to first test this in simulations, we need to be able to simulate multivariate clustered data that resembles what we might see in practice. And so we used a method proposed by Waller et al. In this fungible package in R that basically simulates artificial data sets with clusters that resemble real data sets on features such as cluster size, shape, and orientation, and allows a lot more user-defined tweaking of these parameters than, say, simply using like a Gaussian cluster framework. So other specifications for the simulation, we had 20 total covariates, for which 10 were randomly selected at each iteration to generate the outcome model. In baseline, a linear model, but we also included the possible addition of quadratic terms, interactions between variables, or enclosing that linear model within a step function in order to create a binary outcome. We had 5 clusters in each training set at baseline, unless I otherwise specify it, and 3 in each test set. And so here are the results over, again, 3 different data generating scenarios. In panel A, we looked at the effect of increasing the strength of the signal from the covariates in the true outcome model as measured by the magnitude of the coefficient vector. And in the second panel, we looked at varying the number of true clusters within each training set while keeping the overall size constant at 5,000 per training set. And then in panel C, we kind of considered the opposite. This time keeping the number of clusters constant at 5, but increasing the sample size per cluster. And what we see throughout is that our cross-clustered weighted forest approach, as shown in green, outperforms all others, and often by a considerable margin. And that actually all 3 ensembling approaches significantly improve upon the merged, especially for certain values of these simulation parameters. Something interesting to note here is that the multi-method, which as you remember is training on the true clusters, does not perform really better than either the cluster or this random subsection methods when our value K is higher than the number of true clusters. And basically, this is pointing at evidence that increasing the number of partitions of the data and the number of components within the ensemble is beneficial, of course, up to a certain point at which the number of samples per partition becomes too low for training. But that when we use the silhouette score to choose this optimal value of K, it tends to be much greater than the number of true clusters that we simulated at baseline. So again, we want to evaluate this on a real data set to see if it holds up. So we used the low grade gliomas data set, again, taken from Bioconductor, that measures 500 or so patients, again, with gene expression data as our features that we're training on. We looked at predicting two outcomes. The first was the mutation count per sample, and that was considered to be a continuous outcome, at least by the random forest learners. The second is a binary outcome, which is tumor grade, and that was categorized as either high or low. And the reason that we were interested in this particular data set is that the gene expression features that we used as covariates had been previously clustered by the original authors using unsupervised approaches. So we actually had their cluster assignments, and we basically wanted to test the robustness of this overall framework to the choice of clustering method instead of necessarily using something like k-means. And so what we see on the left is the results on predicting the mutation count, that continuous outcome, and on the right, the performance on predicting the tumor grade outcome. Again, as my metric, I'm using the percent change in the average root mean squared error from the merged learner, the like classic random forest learner. And I've shown the performance of the top two weighting approaches in combining the predictions of those cluster level forests. We see, as usual, that the stacked regression on the right-hand side of these panels performs the best. But what was interesting here is that actually weighting each forest by the inverse of the sample size actually ended up doing pretty well in this context, even though that weighting approach does not tend to be robust to various data generating scenarios. In this one, it did quite well, but stacked regression still did better. And we see on the left-hand side from the continuous outcome that we improve quite considerably on classic random forest by about 75 or 80% in the median over several different iterations. And that for a binary outcome, this is still really effective with about 25% improvement over classic random forest on average. So finally, now that we have kind of evaluated that this approach can be effective when we have heterogeneity within our training data, we're more interested in learning why and if we can gain more intuition as to what's actually happening here. And so to that end, we looked at decomposing the mean squared error of the predictions into their bias in various components and seeing if there was a clear pattern in where the improvements arise. And for this comparison, I was looking at comparing the merged learner, our baseline random forest, to that multi-approach where we're training a forest on each of the true clusters within a simulation study. The reason for that is because this is a much more analytically tractable framework that we can explore in actually the next aim, while still maintaining the relationship between the ensembling versus merging frameworks that we want to be able to compare. And we see that in this case, the reduction of the bias is the primary benefit of ensembling over merging, and that the variance component is minimal for both ensembling and merging frameworks. And so finally, to that end, we want to develop a theoretical framework for this ensembling versus merging paradigm, and showing specifically that the upper bound of the mean squared error is higher for classic random forest than for ensembles of forests that are built over clusters. And of course, the motivation is that we want to provide theoretical support to all the empirical observations that I've already discussed. The focus within this is on feature distribution heterogeneity, that is cluster structure. And we actually consider the same outcome model across clusters to basically simplify the framework and allow us to really focus on one type of heterogeneity. And the main goal is to gain intuition as to where the improvements arise, and specifically why for random forest we're seeing sometimes such considerable improvements over the classic random forest algorithm. And our hypothesis is that the bias variance interplay of these individual forests is what determines the benefit, and that specifically reducing the bias is the primary mechanism that the predictions are improved. So to validate this hypothesis, we explore the behavior of ensembles that are either built from linear regression learners or random forest learners under a true linear outcome. The reason for that is that linear regression learners are, of course, unbiased for a linear outcome. And so we can look at this type of learning framework just to focus on the variance component of that mean squared error and see what is happening between ensembling and merging just when we look at the variance. And conversely, for random forest, we showed empirically, and it's actually, you can show theoretically, that the variance component goes to 0. And so that is a way to just focus on the bias term. And this way we can kind of pinpoint theoretically where the improvements are arising. So starting with linear regression, if we are using linear regression learners on a true, this does not even consider a true linear outcome, but we can basically express the predictions as follows. This is kind of pretty standard. And if we use, within the ensembling framework, using inverse variance weighting has also been proven to produce the minimal variance across all possible weighting approaches. So we consider that when building the ensembles. Then we can obtain closed form expressions for the variances of the merged learner and the ensemble learner. And then the next step is to take limits of these expressions to determine what's happening asymptotically. And so I will be showing our high dimensional asymptotic analysis, but also mention that the fixed dimensional analysis led to the same conclusions. And so in our high dimensional setup, we are now assuming that the number of covariates grows proportionally with the sample size as both go to infinity, and that the ratio of the number of covariates to the sample size converges to some constant gamma within 0, 1/2. And so this kind of complicates things over fixed dimensional analysis, because now we have to consider random matrix theory when we are taking the limits of those expressions for the variances. So in this framework, we included 2 clusters within the training set, because that makes it a bit easier to calculate, and that we can then generalize to further clusters once we have that result. We assumed that the training and the test covariate data followed some multivariate distribution with unit variance, and then an additional specification that our test point x star had to have mean 0. But we did not stipulate the form that the multivariate distribution had to take. So given all these pieces, we can take limits of the previous expressions and actually calculate an asymptotic ratio of the variance of the merged to the variance of the ensemble, and show that asymptotically, the merged is strictly better than the ensemble. And this follows our hypothesis that reducing the bias is the way that ensembling improves over merging. In this framework, there is no bias to reduce. And so in fact, it is not actually beneficial to ensemble. So we want to verify through simulations that the limit that we just derived holds up. And so we considered 3 different distributional paradigms. The first is looking at uniform clusters, the second at Gaussian distributed clusters, and the third at Laplacian distributed clusters. And we see the theoretical limit is shown in red, and the simulations are shown by the points. And we see that the limit is fairly close to what we see in simulations across these different distributions as we vary that parameter gamma from its limits, from 0 to 1. 1 per cluster, or 0 to 1/2 for the overall training set. So finally, we can get to our random forest analysis. And for this, we used the centered random forest algorithm, which is a slightly simplified version of the classic algorithm that has properties that are much more easily analyzable through theory, while kind of keeping the flavor of what makes random forest so successful. And we focused on the squared bias to characterize the mean squared error because we can show that the variance component goes to 0. So given this, we can actually represent the predictions of both the merged and the ensemble learners as weighted averages of the training outcome values, where the choice of the weights is what differentiates merging from ensembling. And so for this analysis, we focused on uniformly distributed clusters, the reason for which is that all previous theory for random forests has been built on uniform clusters. And so if we wanted to use any of that, it was much more helpful to kind of follow similar distributional requirements. And we specified that our test point that we were obtaining a prediction on was a deterministic mixture of our 2 cluster level uniform distributions. We, in this analysis, specified that the 2 clusters came from uniform distributions of equal width that were non-overlapping. And so these endpoints are arbitrary and really could be anything as long as the width was the same and they did not overlap. So we generated an outcome through a linear model and additionally included possible sparsity in this outcome generating model, where S was our sparsity parameter representing the number of non-zero coefficients in that linear model. We also use the parameter P sub n, which is the probability that a given variable is chosen at each split of training a decision tree within each forest. And this parameter P sub n converges to 1 over the number of strong variables, that is non-zero variables, or 0 if the variable is not in fact in the true outcome model. So basically, the idea is that this procedure adaptively selects only the strong variables. And this is one of the mechanisms through which random forest is so effective when the number of covariates is greater than the number of samples, is that it inherently can handle sparsity in whatever the outcome generating model might be. Finally, we have the parameter K sub n, where log of K sub n describes the total number of splits and therefore the depth of each tree within a forest. So given all of these pieces, we can now derive upper bounds of the mean squared error for the ensemble and the merged learner, and actually show that when the bounds are tight, that the ensemble is exactly twice as accurate as the merged in this framework. And the bounds depend on the sparsity, S, and the split probability, P sub n, and the constant that determines the tree depth, which is that K sub n. And in terms of the fact that these are upper bounds and not tight limits, this is, at least as of yet, the best that we can do. And actually the paper that we were basing these derivations on showed that you could not tighten the bounds any further to what they are. So the intuition, instead of really showing every step of the derivation, I thought I would distill it to what really mattered. And that is that the merged ignores the cluster structure of the data and instead treats the data as arising from the combination of the 2 cluster level distributions. Here we specify that each cluster was a uniform distribution with width 1/2. The merged basically treats all of the training data as arising from a uniform 0-1 distribution, or a uniform distribution with width 1, essentially just putting them together, and ignoring the fact that given the training data, knowing that one covariate lies in either of our intervals actually tells you exactly where all the other covariates must lie. If the first covariate of a training point lies in the interval 0-1/2, the way the training data is structured, that tells you that the rest of the covariates within that sample should also be in the interval 0-1/2, whereas the merged will treat it as if it could possibly be in the whole interval 0 to 1. The ensemble, conversely, takes the different cluster distributions explicitly into account. And the way it does that is within the form of the weights that basically weight the true training outcomes informing the predictions. So for the merge, the combining of these distributions occurs within the weights themselves, whereas for the ensemble, the form of the weight is directly dependent on which interval our test point falls in, and that determines everything about how each training point will be weighted in the overall prediction. And so finally, we want to verify this finding again through simulations. And we looked at the same three distributions as for the linear regression case, uniform, Gaussian, and Laplacian, and actually looked at, instead of just considering 2 clusters per training set as in our theoretical analysis, increasing the number of clusters from 2 all the way up to 30. And what we see is that the ratio of the ensemble in red to the merged in green converges to a relative constant as the number of clusters increases and is very similar across distributions. And this is some evidence that we can kind of generalize what we found with uniform clusters to other different distributions. One thing to note is that given the same kind of derivation setup as we use for 2 clusters, we can actually come up with limits for higher number of clusters. But given these simulations, the theoretical bounds get significantly less tight as the number of clusters increases. And so that is definitely something to look into for future work to see if there's any way to basically tighten up the bounds. However, the overall relationship between the ensemble and merged is preserved between the theory and the practice across any number of clusters that we at least considered. So kind of looking at this body of work as a whole, it is essentially designed to adapt to any heterogeneity within the available training data, specifically when this is in the form of multiple studies or clusters within a single training data set, because this is such a common problem to encounter within biology. So we have shown here that this heterogeneity can be leveraged by ensembles of random forests to more accurately predict features of biological relevance. And finally, that the theoretical insights support our empirical observations, that when we ensemble over heterogeneous partitions, we improve upon simply ignoring any potential cluster structure within the data. Okay, and that brings me to the end. Okay, so the question is, okay, when weighting forests and trees, I'm curious to what extent were these parts weighted? And how does it relate to picking individual decision trees that are based on the forest's feature importances and forming a forest of those? That's actually, yeah, no, it's a great question. I did not show it today, but we looked a lot at the variable importance feature that random forest can give you and looking at how that changed when we weighted the trees versus the forests. And so essentially, I think my answer to this would be to consider this collection of forests and when we weight the individual trees as itself kind of like a mega forest. We're essentially always forming some ensemble of decision trees at the end. It's just the way that these decision trees are trained, what data they're trained on, and how they're weighted is what differs between kind of this classic random forest and the approaches that I was talking about here. And I think in terms of feature importance, the way that that's incorporated is in the fact that we are training each forest, of course, on a specific subset of the data, and that is going to lead to different features being important in different subsets. Then how we weight those is the kind of final step in kind of the overall, what I would say, the overall ensemble level feature importances. And that is kind of how the weighting forests versus the weighting trees would be ultimately distinguished from each other.
Yeah, I have one
Sure.
question. So your method is generalizable, right?
Yeah.
So when you say generalizable, do you have some one big target population in your mind, or you have the multiple target population, heterogeneous target?
Exactly. I think that's more the idea, is that it should be you shouldn't need to, define your training procedure based on some target population. Hopefully you can use whatever you've trained on, like a number of different applications without needing to, retrain it based on that. And so I think the idea is to kind of balance the idea of overfitting to the training data with prediction accuracy on a wide variety of test sets. Yeah, go for it.
So it's super interesting how the clustering approach could work better than just partitioning by the tree clusters.
Right.
And I guess it's interesting because that suggests that a clustering algorithm will do a better job of detecting tree clusters may not be the best one to use.
Exactly.
So I guess what like commonality, what kind of patterns are useful for clustering?
Well, I think the idea is that like the clustering algorithms basically create partitions of the data that are as homogeneous within and as heterogeneous without. And so combining that with the stacked regression, the idea is that if we train a learner on one cluster, like one estimated cluster that does really well on the other estimated clusters, they're basically doing well on as partitions of the training data that are as dissimilar as possible, kind of like in a data-driven way. And so those are more likely to generalize to anything. And I think like that's at least the intuition that we were trying to get from that. And that like true clusters, I think, don't necessarily form the partitions that are going to be the most homogeneous, and however you're describing that within each partition versus without. So yeah.
Do you have any thoughts about how you might extend these methods to a situation that is maybe more similar to domain adaptation, where you have the features for a future study, but not the outcomes, and you're trying to train something that will work well right away?
And so yeah, like kind of like transfer learning type.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, honestly, that's something I've been thinking about actually after the PhD in my work now. And I think that a lot of what we're doing here could actually be agnostic of the outcome, especially in the fact that we can kind of just consider what we're calling feature distribution heterogeneity. And if we can model that within kind of both the training and test, then like kind of, something somewhat semi-supervised in terms of the outcome would hopefully adapt better to that test data if we're already able to kind of characterize the feature distribution heterogeneity. But that's my like very broad intuition. I haven't specifically tried to extend these, but I think it's a very important question. Yeah.
So I have a question on the stack regression portion.
Sure.
It's really fascinating. So when you choose which trees to keep in the random forest,
Yeah.
You say you use a regression where each of the features is a tree.
Yeah.
Are you using the training data to get those coefficients?
Yes.
Okay. I was wondering about, like I know in some of the machine learning things, they'll actually divide data into 3 different sets. So it's like you have an initial training and then kind of like a validation set and then your final testing set.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if that might be something to consider in choosing the features, the trees and the stack regression. I don't know if it would.
Yeah, I think it could be. And I think so with the stacked regression, there's a little bit of like overlap in terms of, but I think the idea is that we're trying to get we're basically trying to separate what each learner was trained on from what predictions we're taking for the most part, because we're basically regressing their predictions on all the studies that they weren't trained on against whatever the true outcomes were. So in a way that's a little bit similar to splitting it up into training and testing, but it's not so kind of like, it's not global in that we're just always leaving out like 2 studies for, whatever kind of cross validation and training on the rest. But here it's that the regression weights are based on the predictions of learner 1 on studies like 2 through 10. And so in that way, it's at least not reusing the same training data for testing. Yeah, it is. Exactly. Yeah.
So the same concept.
Yeah. Oh wait, there's a chat.
So we have one more question.
Yeah. I had a quick question about that. Okay. So this is a question on the optimal value of K selected when running the experiment where decision trees of depth 100 were fit on the clusters obtained from K-means clustering. how does increasing or decreasing the value of K relate to the generalizability of the model? Is there a trade-off of some kind between the two? The answer is definitely there is. And that kind of what we found is that to a point, increasing the value of K tends to be very beneficial. And that's, I think the idea there is that essentially because we have more of these very distinct partitions of the data, and we have more of a chance of identifying really beneficial learners that we can upweight. And when we looked at the weights given to overall forests within that ensemble, we did find a wide distribution, so that some were like heavily upweighted and some were kind of conversely heavily downweighted. And then of course the trade-off is in the sample size to train each forest on versus the number of partitions. And of course, that's just going to be completely dependent on the size of your data. And I think that we found that when it gets below about like 40 samples per partition, that it just kind of falls off. And so I think that, you know, to a point, increasing K up to the point that you can create partitions of around that size, you'll see likely benefits, and then it'll drop off. Cool.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Wonderful.